What I'm going to try to do is I'm not sure it's going to be exactly a theological exegesis of holiness, but I do want to examine holiness and the holy man from a different perspective. And I can guarantee you, or promise you, I'm not going to solve the problem by the end of this. It begins, or at least I'll begin here, by you might say that holiness can be consummated by way of the nose, the smell. When Antonius, who's the author of a shorter Greek Vita of Simeon Stylites, noticed that Simeon had not moved for several days on top of his pillar, he climbed up to discover that indeed Simeon had died. And this is quoting from Robert Duran's translation. Throughout his body and his garments was a scented perfume, which from its sweet smell made one's heart merry. Now this was in stark contrast when you read, if you read the earlier part of the story, to particularly two instances in the Vita where Simeon's body, in both cases his leg, was, I guess we can just give it the general description, it was gangrenous. And its odor was repulsively putrid. Simeon declared in both cases that the infected leg was really, this was a sign and a smell of his sinful spiritual condition. But after 47 years atop the pillar, the sweet smell of his corpse evoked the verdict and the aroma of holiness. Another case is, and this is admittedly not a Vita of late antiquity, though it shares a lot of the motifs. When Father Sozyma dies in Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, the beloved and the greatly honored holy man almost immediately began to stink, and to stink a lot. The faithful who had gathered for the services were confused, distraught, and indeed scandalized, because how can a holy man smell like an ordinary human being at his death? Many who despised Sozyma's holiness within the community, there was a lot of rivalry and apparently jealousy of him, openly rejoiced, and they pontificated, God's justice is not like man's. Well, holiness, sanctity in a human being appears, at least for some authors, some of our works, assessed by the odor of corruption. But back atop, we're going to go back to Simeon's pillar. Incredulity appears again. Theodoret wrote perhaps the most familiar life of Simeon, and he reported that a pious deacon from Rabbina confronted Simeon one day and said, "Tell me, are you human or an incorporeal nature?" Now the proof that the questioning man received from Simeon was that he invited him to come up and see his ulcerous leg, which at that time was most certainly wafting the odor of corruption. And that's how he knew he was a man. Now, my focus is not going to be on so much the activities of sanctity and holiness, but on at least for a while, looking at the nature of holiness and the holy man and woman when they are not acting or appearing to be in a traditionally holy manner. And of course that is open to definition as well. The interpretations of these misbehaviors by their hagiographers give paradoxical insight into the character of the holy man in late antiquity and beyond. Of course, how do we know about holy men? It's through what we generally would call hagiography. And that is our source, and it is our problem. The hagiographical literature from which we glean the identity and nature of the holy man rarely provides the kind of reporting that we expect, say, in modern historiography. But these tales are, in essence, just like the Gospels, in that they situate these holy men and women in their historical context, but they, instead of giving us a lot of more the context that we want, they focus on the theological proclamation of a person possessed by God. Whole hagiography, therefore, makes, in many cases, maybe not invents, but makes, almost creates the legend of holy men and women, but almost never defines the full character and content of their holiness. What it does, though, is important. The hagiographer begins by identifying, and we'll see this term a little bit later, signifies such and such a person as holy, and then later commodifies him. I will be referring to a recent study by Andrew Jacobs in a few minutes. Daily life with a holy man, for most of us, can only be imagined. So looking at Simeon Stylites' Vita from a different angle, Theodoret and Antonius both recite this gruesome incident in his early life as a young man when he was in a monastery and he tightened a rope around his leg and he left it there for over a year. And it festered, and it was discovered by his fellow monks eventually, of course, by its smell. The longer Syriac life does not describe this particular incident, but it nevertheless relates his extreme ascetical behaviors. And indeed, in the first two hagiographers there, Theodoret and Antonius, Simeon is expelled from the monastery because his behavior is described as being a dangerous example to his brothers, as well as exhibiting a very stubborn ego, even a touch of insanity, and certainly not genuinely holy from their perspective. The Syriac life, which is the longest one of them, it's an anonymous work, portrays the other monks continually complaining about Simeon's, can we say, super asceticism as an attempt to belittle them. The abbot is sympathetic to Simeon, but one day when the 120 strong members of the monastery come to the abbot and tell him that it's either Simeon or all of us who leaves, he grudgingly goes with the bigger numbers. Yet once Simeon departs from the monastery, these three authors leave these incidents behind, unresolved. The implication is that this was a training period for the eventual Stylite, a portent of his ascetical and spiritual feats to come. The hagiographers appear to sidestep or rationalize away Simeon's behavior during this earlier period in light of his future celebrity. Rationalization, though, is, as we find in much of late antique and beyond literature, is legion. In the 4th century anonymous Book of Steps, the 9th discourse concerns, apparently the author was being asked, what about all those Old Testament prophets who did terrible things, killed people, murdered them, and so forth? What about them? How are they holy? And he responds, he says, well, yes, they did do these terrible things, but at God's command. And how they are eventually vindicated and welcomed into the kingdom of heaven only after the apostles have been received. So saints retain their holiness despite despicable actions, as long as, at least from the person evaluating their lives, they have been directed by God to perform such and such an unholy deed. Another example of this is with the life of Timothy I. He was generally considered, or is generally considered, the greatest of the Church of the East patriarchs, or Catholicoi. He reigned from 780 to 823. He resided in Baghdad. He's well known. We have a lot of the documents debated with Islamic leaders. He provided manuals, really, for lay people about how Christians should respond to Islamic challenges about their faith. So he gave them the rhetorical tools to defend their faith. Thomas of Marga wrote compiled a book called the Book of Governors in the late 9th century. Ostensibly, it presents the history of the Beth Abbey monastery and its leaders, and also includes, a number of theological controversies, ecclesiastical events, not just of the monastery, but of other places, other monasteries, other personalities. There is a short entry concerning how Timothy was elected to the Catholicate, using less than ethical means. And in fact, Marga Thomas uses the word that he gained his position fraudulently. He uses that adverb a couple times. Essentially, Timothy was looking to become, or he wanted to become the Catholicate. He was ambitious for this, and there were other people supporting him. But there was an older man, Mar Ishoyab, who apparently was the front runner and the favorite of the Islamic leaders. So Thomas, and this has been ascertained from several different sources, went to Mar Ishoyab and said to him, if you're old, you're not going to live that long. Why don't you just, withdraw from this order, and if you do, and I win, I'm going to make you the Metropolitan of Adia Bene. And so Ishoyab withdrew. Timothy was elected, and a few days later, Ishoyab became the Metropolitan of Adia Bene. I guess there's a common phrase for that we've heard a lot today, quid pro quo. Intriguing, though, is the then following injustification for Timothy's cunning behavior, that it was just like Jacob's trickery of his brother Esau. And just like Jacob, Thomas goes on, Timothy proved to be the more worthy by God's standards, which are not like humanity's. It was God who inserted, for instance, the lust for wild game into Isaac, sending Esau off for a long hunt far in the country, opening the door and giving time for Jacob to be able to get that position. The Book of Governors also offers a lengthy chapter on the reign and the activity of an abbot, Coriolis. He was the abbot of Beth Abbey. Rabban Coriolis was of, I guess we could say, of classical Syriac ascetical stock. He devoted himself to all the spiritual disciplines, to fasting, prayer, vigils. He was famous in particular, or infamous for extreme physical confinement in order to quell the passions of his body. He supposedly avoided notoriety But as typically happens when people try to avoid notoriety, he became quite renowned for his athletic asceticism, and eventually he was elected abbot. Thomas then takes pains to describe the discipline that he then instilled in his monks. And to say it in a short phrase, he suffered no nonsense. And then he adds, he blurts out really an incidental note. He says, now, Rabban Kyriakos was of a hot-tempered disposition and was easily made furious with anger. And when he was moved to wrath, he was not to be controlled. So one day, and he follows that immediately with one story, one day he encountered Rabban Sergius. They bumped into each other in a passageway. And Sergius was supposedly seduced by Satan, and he swore at Coriolis. Actually, it was a pretty bad one. He said, gee, I would have rather run into Satan than you. And the fellow who can't control his anger, the holy man, would take none of that, and he commanded that Satan seize control of Sergius. Thomas moves ahead 50 years, and he says Sergius was still in the monastery, and he still was a babbling idiot and bereft of all reason. Does holiness enable one to manipulate evil? The rest of the life of Kyriakos, just to show you, is full of all the miracles that he did and how he helped so many people, and was a spiritually wise person. Thomas of Marga does not conceal such behavior, but he records it alongside, again, these later wonderful accomplishments of Kyriakos. The common understanding of the holy man and his holiness is that he is always holy. Of course, as we can read in many of these stories, except when he is not. All those stories about pure, devout, holy men who heal and reconcile and utter remarkably wise sayings with no one hating them except for perhaps some demonic characters, those are nice. But are they representing, what the true nature of being a holy man in that society is? Examining this paradox of common belief and real misbehaving, the ambiguity of holiness can lead us toward a fuller comprehension of this phenomenon. Yuval Rotman's monograph in the last few years on insanity and sanctity in Byzantium connects, I think, critical points here about the ambiguity of the holy man and the fool, the holy fool. The better known cases, such as Simeon the fool, portray men who pretend to be insane in order, one, it's a way of demonstrating their utter humility, but then also to anonymously minister to others, especially the lowest in society. And that, if you act like you're insane and people think you are, it's a great way to get away with saying and doing outrageous things which shock normal people into hearing the truth about themselves. The vitae of holy fools persistently depict this scenario, but Rotman points out that there is no known story in which a certified insane person, someone who really is insane, fulfills the role of the holy fool. Since it almost always happens that the hagiographer reveals his true identity after he has died. And who is he revealing it to? He's revealing it to his readership. His antics never came to the populace that who reputedly experienced his antics never really come to understand who he was and what his real calling was. The revelatory instant is a literary and not a social event. Those who read about the Holy Fool, Rotman has pointed out, are swallowed up in his ambiguity, in which the boundary lines of this liminal character par excellence become blurred. The distinction between sanctity and insanity is lost, for no one ever really knows who is really insane and which holy man is only pretending. So one reserves judgment there. I mean, and this is particularly with the readers, when they encounter people in their community like this, they reserve judgment just in the possibility that such insanity may be telling us the real truth. But touched by holiness, although they did not recognize its presence in such an outrageous and unholy behavior, does the audience and readership of the Holy Fool ever recognize what genuinely constitutes a holy man? Again, what we know about holy men generally comes out of text. Yonatan Maas wrote about Severus of Antioch, the principal figure in the Miaphysite movement. Big, I guess his most important dates are 512 to 538 when he died. And upon the ascension of Justin I to the imperial throne in 518, Severus and other Miaphysite bishops and priests were evicted from their positions. Severus went into exile into Egypt, and he operated, you might say, underground there for a generation until his death. But given his loss of ecclesiastical power and now his mistrust of what was in place in the leadership, Severus became opposed to charisma as the authoritative rule. And then he started to stress a new locus of authority, the intellectual authority of the mediators of the patristic textual tradition. So indeed, he developed a preference for holy texts over and against holy men. He was skeptical of charisma as a means of determining theological truth. Severus insisted upon scriptural and patristic texts to prove theological statements. Now, that may appear to be, again, as we were talking, hearing others say, too scholastic, too intellectual. But while I know that some of us here indeed have met holy men on Athos or perhaps in Egypt, most of us have not. And as alluring as charisma continues to be, I think we all know it can be deceptive and dangerous to authentic faith. Holy texts from the scriptures, let's just, for an example, to Athanasius, to Athanasius's Life of Antony, those continue to be the primary means of making judgments on theological and spiritual matters for most Christians, and indeed about the nature of holiness. Holiness, of course, has its problems. And Alan Middleman escorts us through some of these in an article in the Journal of Analytic Theology a few years ago. He notes that holy seems to indicate a property for many people. It requires, but therefore it would require an underlying physics that makes the property what it is. So this is what he terms an ontological view of holiness, which is strongest when it is conceptually dependent upon the idea of divine presence. As the divine presence departs, holiness declines. Holiness is not perceived as a property, but he goes on, but by being alert to a meaning, noticing a sign. It is an aspect of reality related to empirical facts, but not reducible to them. No less than the meaning of words, holiness has reality of a distinctive kind. Now this reality of a distinctive kind that is alive amidst divinity and weak when divinity is not evident, nudges one towards comprehending some of these earlier stories. It is in the nature of holiness attributed to a human being or artifact not to be continually present. There is a ready tendency, of course, to describe something or someone as holy for ephemeral reasons that Middleman describes as being arbitrary or unwarranted. The last, at least different approach to this is a very recent article by Andrew Jacobs. And it's utilizing some relatively new social scientific studies on celebrities, celebrity cultures. And and what he uses this is to understand the phenomenon of the holy man. It's obvious that there are, in fact, in our society and in our culture, there are three human roles that are omnipresent among all of us in our conversations. There are celebrities, there are geniuses, and then there are holy men and holy women. I'm going to say that they're
5 minutes.
5 minutes, sure. Jacob lists three principal characteristics of the celebrity. Labeling a person as a celebrity as an act of significance or signification. We often do not know the person until they are heralded as a celebrity. Seldom do you and I have the opportunity to discover and identify a holy man. We simply hear or read about someone else's identification of them. The power and the role of the celebrity is to represent the active construction of identity in the social world. The burden of being a celebrity is that one's real personality is dislodged from the signification. He or she is no longer allowed to be who he is, but what people want him to be. And as a result, celebrities become ambiguous. Their signs shift. The star, if we want to go back to I think what we're more familiar with in all of our cultures, the star becomes at once exemplary, meaning just like us, but he's also at the same time extraordinary. He's in a world of his own, and therefore not like us. Stars embody cultural contradictions in the realm of identity, as we've seen in several of these incidents that I've cited earlier. The third characteristic or development of the celebrity is commodification, a public process which further reveals the celebrity or the holy man from the original person. And indeed, he becomes a caricature. And a character paints what somebody wants us to see as being represented in and by a person, not what she really is. Many of the Persian martyr acts, such as Bainim and Sarah, tell the story of holy people who the scholars now have a strong consensus that they never existed. These stories put a patchwork quilt together of characteristics and scenarios that fit the situation and agenda of the hagiographer's world. No ambiguities. The principles do nothing unholy. Given that Simeon Stylites and other holy persons were human, however, the absence of ambiguities and unholiness ironically clouds the nature of authentic holiness. I'm going to move just quickly to finish up here. Hagiography is indeed a form of commodification in which the persona of the holy man and woman is abstracted away from his or her material presence. A life, a true human life, becomes a vita. A precise delineation of holiness and therefore a holy person is by nature indefinable. Genius, which I mentioned earlier and don't have the time to really examine, has been studied a lot in recent years. There's been all sorts of methods trying to define what genius is, and therefore trying to predict it, maybe even to control genius. Family history, physiological traits, all of these, they've all eventually reached a cul-de-sac. And what most of the academic studies of genius tend to do is to devolve into a history and analysis of people identified as geniuses. In other words, they are lives of the saints. Peter Brown did not invent the holy man, but he certainly enlivened our discussion and focused us upon it. And while at times he overstates his case, in some instances, his most valuable identifier is that the holy man is a stranger, ambiguous, attractive, and repulsive at the same time. And I'm going to conclude with just two notes. I've talked about this in other papers in the past. Two notes from a Reformed Protestant tradition, which is mine. The late John Webster came close. He said that the Christian sanctity is in Christ, in the Spirit, not in se. It is always an alien sanctity. Sanctification does not signal the birth of self-sufficiency. Rather, it indicates a perpetual and inherent lack of self-sufficiency. And Karl Barth, the person that John Webster studied the most, said that holiness has unquestionably the meaning of strange. God comes to a human being, but not to be at home in them. Thank you very much.